The last good day began, as the best days often do, with the crisp, pine-scented promise of discovery. Dr. Eris Thorne stood on the edge of a rhyolite cliff, the morning sun warming the back of her neck, and felt the familiar thrum of the earth's secrets beneath her feet. She was a geologist, but that title felt too sterile, too academic for the passionate communion she felt with stone and time. She was a reader of Earth's deep history, a translator of its silent, layered language. Her expertise was not merely learned, it was innate, a form of profound empathy for the planet itself. She could look at a cliff face like this one, a chaotic jumble of volcanic rock in the heart of Yellowstone National Park, and see a story as clear as any printed page. The explosive fury of the caldera's birth, the slow, patient sculpting by ice and water, the subtle chemical whispers of the geothermal activity that still simmered just below the surface. She pointed with her rock hammer, its blue vinyl grip a familiar weight in her hand. "You see that, Leo? That banding?" Her voice was alive with an energy that the landscape seemed to echo. "That's flow banding." The lava was so thick, like honey, and as it oozed out, the different minerals separated into layers. It's like a frozen river. Beside her, 7-year-old Leo squinted, his small face a perfect miniature of her own, all sharp angles and intense curiosity. He wasn't just a vulnerability factor, a tag-along for his mother's research trip. He was her apprentice, her little pebble, the repository for all the wonder she felt. Their bond was forged in this shared language of the natural world. While other kids learned about cartoons and video games, Leo learned about feldspar and obsidian, about the immense pressure that creates diamonds and the slow tenacity of lichen. He reached out a small hand and touched the rock face. "Is it still hot?" he whispered, as if not to wake it. Eris smiled, a brilliant, unreserved expression that made her seem younger than her 38 years. "Not here, but deep, deep down, it is. The whole park is like a giant pot of water with the stove left on low. That's what makes the geysers go." She crouched down, her knee popping softly, and ran her fingers over a patch of glistening black rock. Obsidian. Volcanic glass. The lava cooled so fast it didn't have time to make crystals. It's impatient, this rock. Leo mirrored her, his own small fingers tracing the smooth, cool surface. He understood. He always did. This was their church, this cathedral of ancient fire and stone. The air was thin and clean at this altitude, and the view stretched for miles, a tapestry of lodgepole pine, golden aspen, and the distant ethereal plumes of steam from the Norris Geyser Basin. It was a perfect moment, one of those crystalline slivers of time that feel eternal. Eris knew she had to capture it, to send a piece of it back to the other anchor of her life. She pulled out her phone, the modern world an incongruous intrusion in this timeless place. "Okay, Pebble, selfie time. For Dad." Leo groaned theatrically but leaned in, pressing his cheek against her fleeced jacket. She wrapped an arm around him, holding him tight, the solid, warm reality of him a grounding force against the immense scale of the landscape. She framed the shot with a geyser erupting faintly in the far distance, a white feather against the impossible blue of the Wyoming sky. Click. She typed a quick message to her husband Ben, her thumbs moving swiftly. "Found a new favorite spot. Home soon. Love you." She attached the photo, a digital proof of life, a snapshot of pure, unadulterated happiness, and hit send. The message flew out into the ether, a tiny packet of love and light from the heart of the wilderness. Back in their small rental house in Bozeman, Ben Thorne's phone chimed. He glanced at the screen, and a smile spread across his face. It was Eris. And Leo. His son's face was scrunched up in that way he did when he was pretending to be annoyed, but was secretly thrilled. Eris was beaming, her eyes full of the wild, intelligent light he'd fallen in love with 2 decades ago. He saved the photo, his heart swelling. They were his whole world, those two. He sent back a simple, "Love you more. Dinner's at 7. Don't be late. I'm making the good pasta." The hours passed easily at first. He chopped vegetables, put water on to boil, listened to a podcast. 7 o'clock came and went. He frowned. Aris was often late when she was deep in her work. Time tended to dissolve for her when she was on the trail of a geological puzzle. He sent a text. "Pasta's getting cold." No reply. He covered the pot and sat down to read, the pleasant anticipation of their return slowly beginning to curdle. By 8 the sun had dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple that he knew Aris would be appreciating somewhere out there. He tried to call her, straight to voicemail. A knot of irritation tightened in his stomach. It was irresponsible to be out this late with Leo. By 9, the irritation had morphed into a cold, creeping dread. This wasn't like her. Not when Leo was with her. Her professionalism, her deep competence, extended to her role as a mother above all else. He called again. Voicemail. He paced the kitchen, the smell of the uneaten pasta turning his stomach. He began to rationalize. A flat tire, a dead phone battery. They stopped for ice cream and lost track of time. Each excuse felt flimsy, a paper-thin shield against a growing certainty that something was wrong. His mind, unbidden, started to supply images from the park safety pamphlets. Bears, bison, sheer cliffs, boiling hot springs. He pushed them away, his heart hammering against his ribs. By 10 at lock, the dread was no longer creeping. It was a suffocating blanket. The rationalizations were gone, replaced by a single, terrifying silence. He picked up his phone, his hand trembling so badly he had to dial twice. He navigated the automated menu for Yellowstone National Park until he got to the emergency line. A calm, professional voice answered. "Yellowstone National Park, Ranger Dispatch. What is your emergency?" Ben took a breath, but the words came out as a ragged gasp. "My wife," he said, his voice cracking. "My wife and my son. They went into the park this morning. They haven't come back." The mobilization was swift and immense, an army summoned to fight a ghost. Within hours of Ben's call, the park's formidable search and rescue apparatus roared to life. The command post, established in a large ranger station near the park's west entrance, became the nerve center of a massive operation. The air inside was thick with the smell of strong coffee, damp Gore-Tex, and the low-level hum of anxiety. Maps of the northern range of Yellowstone, where Aris's car was found parked in a small pullout, were spread across every available surface, their topographical lines and shaded relief already being crosshatched with the grids of the impending search. Lead Ranger Marcus Thorne, a man whose shared surname with the missing family felt like a cruel irony, stood before a whiteboard, his face a grim mask of professional focus. He was a veteran of dozens of such operations, a man who understood the brutal mathematics of time and temperature in the high country. He directed the flow of personnel and resources with a calm authority that belied the urgency of the situation. Rangers, seasoned volunteers from county search teams, and specialists from neighboring jurisdictions converged, their trucks and SUVs filling the parking lot. An army, yes, but its enemy was vast, indifferent, and maddeningly empty. The methodology of the search was a science in itself, a systematic attempt to impose human logic onto the chaos of the wild. Marcus broke it down for his teams with practiced precision. Ground pounders were running standard parallel sweeps, 20-meter spacing. Eyes on the ground, people. We're looking for anything. A footprint, a piece of trash, a broken branch, anything that says human. The first teams moved out at dawn, lines of men and women in bright jackets advancing slowly through the dense lodgepole forests and across wide sagebrush-covered valleys. From the air, the effort was just as systematic. A park helicopter began flying low, slow transects, its spotters scanning the terrain with powerful binoculars. At night, a different aircraft would take over, one equipped with a forward-looking infrared FLIR camera, a technology that could turn the cold, dark landscape into a ghostly tableau of heat signatures. But even this advanced tool had its limitations here. Yellowstone is a geothermal wonderland, a place where the ground itself breathes heat. The FLIR screen would be a confusing mosaic of warm spots, a slumbering bison, a herd of elk, a fissure in the earth venting steam, making the task of isolating two human forms a near impossibility. The K-9 units, usually the searcher's most potent weapon, were also struggling. The park was a cacophony of scents: elk, deer, coyote, bear, and the ever-present sulphurous tang of the geyser basins. The dogs, their powerful noses overwhelmed, cast about uncertainly, their frustrated whines a testament to the challenge. The wilderness was not just withholding its secrets, it was actively scrambling the tools used to find them. For a young ranger named Ethan, on his first major search and rescue operation, the reality on the ground was a grueling lesson in futility. He was assigned to a grid in a steep, wooded drainage a few miles from where Eris's car was found. The physical difficulty was immense. He scrambled over fields of fallen timber, the dead trees like giant pickup sticks, and pushed through thickets of willow that clawed at his clothes. His lungs burned in the thin mountain air. But the physical strain was nothing compared to the mental exhaustion. Every shadow looked like a person. Every piece of dark wood, for a split second, resolved itself into a crumpled form. His eyes, constantly scanning, began to ache. The mantra, a footprint, a wrapper, a piece of clothing, repeated in his head until it was meaningless. He found nothing. The ground seemed unnaturally clean, as if swept. There were animal tracks in abundance, but not a single sign that a woman and a child had passed this way. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the wind in the pines and the distant caw of a raven. He felt a growing sense of awe at the sheer scale of the emptiness. It felt less like they were searching for two people and more like they were searching for 2 grains of sand on an infinite beach. The frustration was a physical weight pressing down on him and his teammates. By the end of the first day, as they trudged back to their truck in the gathering dusk, a sense of profound discouragement had settled over the team. They had thrown all their expertise and manpower at the landscape, and the landscape hadn't even registered their presence. Ben Thorne existed in a state of suspended animation at the command post. He was a civilian ghost in a world of uniforms and crackling radios. He drank cups of coffee he didn't taste and stared at the maps, the grids and lines blurring into an abstract representation of his own personal hell. He watched the searchers come and go, their faces etched with fatigue and a grim resolve that he found both comforting and terrifying. He needed them to be gods, to be infallible, but he could see the human strain in their eyes. Marcus Thorne, the lead ranger, made a point to check in with him every few hours. He was a kind man, his voice gentle, but his words unsparingly direct. "The first 48 hours are critical, Ben. We're hitting it as hard as we can." He would point to the map, showing the areas that had been cleared, the vast swaths of green that had been covered. But to Ben, the cleared sections didn't look like progress. They just looked like places where his wife and son were not. He'd nod, murmur his thanks, and retreat back into the fog of his own thoughts. His mind was a battlefield. One moment he would be clinging to a desperate, irrational hope, picturing Eris using her geological knowledge to find a warm, dry cave, keeping Leo safe. The next he would be consumed by guilt, replaying their last conversation, searching for some clue he'd missed, some sign of distress. Had she seemed tired? Was she pushing herself too hard? The photo she'd sent, once a source of joy, was now an artifact of torture. He would stare at it on his phone, at their smiling faces, and a wave of nausea would wash over him. He was trapped in the moment before the disaster, the moment when everything was still perfect, and the chasm between that moment and this one felt impossibly, cruelly wide. On the fourth day of the search, a flicker of something that looked like hope ignited. It came not from the professional teams, but from a volunteer, a retired accountant from Cody, who was methodically walking the banks of the Lamar River, miles downstream from the primary search area. He saw a flash of blue snagged on the branches of a fallen cottonwood that had become lodged in a shallow section of the river. He waded into the cold, fast-moving water, his heart pounding. It was a child's jacket, a lightweight windbreaker, torn at the shoulder. It was blue, with a distinctive yellow zipper. It matched the description of the jacket Leo Thorne had been wearing. The call came into the command post, and the atmosphere, which had grown heavy with resignation, instantly crackled with a new, frantic energy. A new theory, grim but tangible, took hold with breathtaking speed. It was a narrative that made a terrible kind of sense. Eris and Leo had become disoriented, wandered far from their intended trail. Perhaps Eris had suffered a minor injury, a twisted ankle, anything that would have impaired her judgment. They had followed the age-old and often fatal advice for lost hikers: follow water downstream. In the treacherous, steep-sided terrain of the Lamar River Valley, a slip, a fall, would have been catastrophic. For Ben, the news was a complex form of agony. The image of his son's jacket, wet and torn, was horrifying, but it was also something. It was a point on the map, a solid fact in a world that had dissolved into terrifying abstraction. The idea of finding them, even in the worst possible circumstances, offered a perverse kind of relief, the promise of an ending to the unbearable not knowing. The discovery of the jacket triggered a massive strategic pivot. Resources were reallocated with an almost desperate urgency. Marcus Thorne, his face grim, redirected the bulk of his manpower to the Lamar River corridor. The systematic grid searches in the high country were scaled back, the logic being that they couldn't be in two places at once. The new focus was absolute. "I want every foot of this riverbank searched, from the nearest road access down to the confluence," he ordered, his voice sharp over the radio. "Both sides. I want dive teams in the water, checking every deep pool, every snag." The surge of false hope was palpable. Searchers who had been growing demoralized by days of finding nothing now had a concrete objective. They attacked the river corridor with renewed vigor. Specialized dive teams from Jackson were helicoptered in. They suited up in thick neoprene, their faces impassive as they prepared to enter the frigid, murky water. The painstaking, multi-day pursuit of this new, incorrect path was a monumental effort. Searchers rappelled down steep cliffs to access remote sections of the river. Teams in inflatable rafts floated downstream, their eyes scanning the banks and the water for any other sign, a piece of clothing, a backpack, anything. For 3 days, the entire operation, a multi-agency effort costing tens of thousands of dollars a day, revolved around a single, misleading clue. Ben watched it all, caught between the terrible hope for resolution and the primal desperate prayer that they would find nothing, that the jacket was a mistake, that Eris and Leo were still alive somewhere, warm and safe. The debunking came not with a bang, but with a phone call. A frantic mother from Salt Lake City called the park's main information line. She had just seen a news report on a Salt Lake television station about the search in Yellowstone, a segment that included a photo of the recovered jacket. Her voice was shaking. "That's my son's jacket," she said, her words tumbling out. "We were in the park last week, near the Lamar River picnic area. He took it off because he was hot, and we drove off without it. I've been trying to get through for days to ask if anyone had turned it in." The information was relayed to the command post. A stunned silence fell over the room. The lead investigator in charge of evidence checked the details. The brand, the size, a small, faded cartoon character patch on the sleeve that hadn't been released to the media. It all matched the Utah family's description. The jacket had been lost a full week before the Thorns had even entered the park. The false dawn had ended. Marcus Thorne had the unenviable task of delivering the news to Ben. He found him sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck, staring blankly at the river. Marcus approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't need to say much. The look on his face was enough. "Ben," he began, his voice heavy. "The jacket, it wasn't Leo's." The words hung in the air. The fragile structure of hope, built over the last 3 days, didn't just crack. It vaporized, leaving a vacuum of absolute despair. The logistical fallout was immediate. The dive teams were pulled. The river search was called off. The emotional fallout was immeasurable. The energy, the focus, the sense of purpose, it all bled out of the operation. The next day, with all credible leads exhausted and vast areas of wilderness yielding not a single trace, Marcus Thorne held a press conference. With a heavy heart, he announced that the active, large-scale search for Eris and Leo Thorne was being suspended. They hadn't found them. They hadn't found anything. 7 years. A chasm of time that had swallowed hope and left behind only a hollow echo. The world had, of course, moved on. New presidents were elected, wars began and ended, technology marched forward with relentless speed, and Yellowstone National Park welcomed millions of new visitors, each creating their own memories against the same timeless backdrop of geysers and mountains. For them, the story of the missing geologist and her son was, at most, a footnote in a guidebook, a piece of grim local folklore whispered around campfires. But for Ben Thorne, time had not moved. It had fractured on that September evening 7 years ago. He was frozen in the amber of that last good day, while the rest of the universe continued its indifferent spin. His house, once a home filled with the cheerful chaos of family life, had become a mausoleum of memory, each object a sacred relic from a lost civilization. Leo's toys still sat in a basket in the living room. Eris's geological texts still lined the shelves, her bookmarks holding places in conversations that would never be finished. In the vacuum of facts, a false narrative had solidified, becoming the accepted public theory. It was a story that was both tragic and simple, a cautionary tale that served to reinforce the park's dangerous majesty. Eris Thorne, the story went, was a brilliant expert, yes, but expertise can breed hubris. She must have pushed too far, taken an unnecessary risk, misjudged the terrain or the weather. She had led her son off the trail, and the wilderness, in its brutal, impartial way, had claimed them. The theories were specific and gruesome. A grizzly bear attack with no remains left behind. A fall into an unmapped acidic hot spring that dissolved them without a trace. Or perhaps they had simply succumbed to the elements in some remote, undiscovered canyon. These stories provided a kind of closure for the public, a neat box in which to place the untidiness of the unknown. For Ben, they were a constant, grating insult to his wife's memory. Eris was not hubristic. She was meticulous. She respected the wilderness. She didn't challenge it. The narrative was a fiction, a comfortable lie people told themselves to make sense of the senseless. Ben, however, was not a passive mourner. He was the keeper of the truth, and his vigil was not silent. It was a long, grinding war against the encroaching silence and the easy lies. His study, once a place for paying bills and answering emails, had transformed into a cold case command center. The walls were covered in topographical maps of Yellowstone, crisscrossed with lines marking the original search grids and his own new theories. He had spent thousands of dollars he couldn't afford, first on private investigators who re-interviewed the same tired witnesses and came up with nothing, and later on forensic geologists who analyzed the case files with fresh eyes. His most public act of defiance was the website, thorncase.org. It was a stark, somber memorial, but also an active investigative tool. It detailed every known fact of the case, debunked the false narratives, and featured a prominent, anonymous tip line. One evening, 7 years into the long silence, he was on the phone, the scene a familiar tableau of his lonely fight. "No, Frank, I don't care if the ranger felt he was being truthful," Ben said, his voice tight with a frustration honed over years of such conversations. He was speaking to a retired police detective he now paid by the hour. "The timeline doesn't work. The tourist who claimed he saw a woman and a boy near the trailhead said it was around noon. The timestamp on Eris's photo was 11:42 a.m., and she was at least a 2-hour hike from there. It couldn't have been them. It's another dead end, just like the jacket." He hung up, the familiar wave of exhaustion washing over him. He turned back to his scanner, feeding in another page from the original case file, meticulously digitizing every report, every witness statement, every scrap of paper, building his own searchable database. He wasn't just grieving. He was working the case. It was the only way he knew how to continue being a husband to Aris and a father to Leo. His internal monologue was a constant churning river of memory and speculation. The nature of his hope had changed over the years. The frantic, desperate hope of the first weeks and months had burned away, leaving something quieter, harder, and more resilient. It was no longer the hope for a joyful reunion. It was the hope for an answer, any answer, that honored the truth. It was a hope rooted in duty. He felt he owed it to Eris and Leo to simply not stop. To stop would be to accept the false narrative. It would be to concede that they were just another tragic statistic, a story told to scare children around a campfire. He couldn't do that. His love for them had nowhere else to go, so he poured it all into this singular, obsessive task. Some nights he would allow himself to imagine the impossible, a phone call, a discovery, a breakthrough. But mostly he focused on the work, analyzing the pollen reports from the initial search K9s, cross-referencing sun glare angles from satellite photos taken on the day they disappeared, reading geological surveys of the area that Eris herself might have read. It was an act of communion, a way of trying to see the world through her eyes one last time. This long vigil was his penance, his purpose, and the last unbreakable thread connecting him to the life that had been stolen from him. The unlikely messengers arrived on skis, carving lines of ephemeral beauty across a landscape that kept its secrets locked in ice. They were Chloe and Liam, graduate students from the University of Montana, and they were in the remote backcountry of the Gallatin Range for a purpose that was both academic and adventurous. They were mapping unskied couloirs, steep, narrow gullies of snow that offered thrilling descents for those with the skill and nerve to ski them. It was late March, a transitional time in the high country. The deep winter snowpack was beginning to feel the first persistent warmth of the spring sun, creating conditions that were notoriously unstable. They were miles from any official park boundary, in a rugged, forgotten corner of the mountains that saw more grizzly bears than humans. They were an island of bright color and kinetic energy in a vast, monochrome world of rock and snow. Chloe, a geology student herself, was taking snowpack measurements, while Liam, a cartography major, was using a high-precision GPS to mark their route. They were young, competent, and completely unaware that they were about to ski directly into a 7-year-old mystery. The discovery was a consequence of physics and bad luck. They were halfway down a steep, north-facing slope, a beautiful, untracked canvas of powder, when a sound like a thunderclap cracked through the silence. An avalanche. Liam yelled a warning, and they both reacted instantly, skiing hard and fast to the side of the slide path, seeking the relative safety of a thick stand of fir trees. It wasn't a massive, full-depth slab avalanche, but it was powerful enough. A river of snow, ice, and debris poured down the gully they had just been about to enter, a churning, white torrent that scoured the mountainside with terrifying force. It was over in less than a minute, leaving behind a jumbled field of snow blocks and a plume of settling ice crystals that glittered in the afternoon sun. They waited, their hearts hammering, until the mountain was silent again. When they cautiously emerged from the trees, they saw that the slide had done more than just rearrange the snow. In one section, it had acted like a giant plow, shearing away not just the winter's accumulation, but also years of compacted snow and the top layer of soil beneath it. It had exposed a patch of raw, dark earth that likely hadn't seen daylight in a generation. And sticking out of that freshly exposed ground, angled awkwardly, was something that did not belong. It was metallic, with a flash of faded blue. Curious, Chloe carefully made her way across the unstable debris field. As she got closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was a rock hammer, an Estwing with its distinctive one-piece forged steel construction and iconic blue vinyl grip. The head was tarnished and pitted, but the tool was unmistakable. A cold dread, sharp and unfamiliar, prickled at Chloe. She had grown up in Montana. She knew the stories. The famous geologist who had vanished in Yellowstone with her little boy. "Liam," she called out, her voice barely a whisper, "you need to see this." Liam joined her, his eyes wide. They stood in silence for a long moment, the implications of what they were looking at slowly dawning on them. The Thorn case. Could it possibly be? They were miles, a whole mountain range away, from the original search area. It seemed impossible. But the hammer, a geologist's hammer. It was too specific to be a coincidence. Their internal debate was brief but intense. Should they touch it? Should they leave it? They were scientists at heart. They knew the importance of preserving a potential scene. With meticulous care, using the tips of their ski poles, they gently loosened the hammer from the frozen earth. Chloe pulled a sterile sample bag from her geology kit, a bag she normally used for soil samples, and they carefully placed the hammer inside, sealing it shut. They took multiple photos of the location and marked the exact GPS coordinates. The rest of the ski journey back to their car was a somber, silent affair. The thrill of the day was gone, replaced by the heavy, cold weight of the object in Chloe's pack. They were no longer just adventurers. They were custodians of a secret, messengers from a ghost. The Park County Sheriff's Office was a small, quiet building in Livingston. The deputy at the front desk was a man named Henderson, a few months from retirement, with a face as lined as a topographical map. He had been on the force for 30 years and remembered the Thorn case as if it were yesterday. He'd worked 2 straight weeks on the initial search, a grueling, heartbreaking effort that still haunted him. When 2 young skiers, their faces flushed from the cold and etched with a strange solemnity, walked in and placed a sealed evidence bag on his counter, he was initially just annoyed at the paperwork it would generate. Then he saw what was inside. He stared at the hammer, at the iconic blue grip, and a jolt went through him, a powerful shock of memory and adrenaline. He didn't need to check the file. He remembered the photos from the press conferences, the images of Eris Thorn on the trail, this exact tool so often in her hand or hanging from her belt. He looked up from the hammer to the 2 young faces watching him. "Where?" he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Did you find this?" As Chloe explained the location, the avalanche, the coordinates, a new expression took shape on Henderson's weathered face, the grim, focused look of a hunter who has just found a fresh track after 7 years of a cold trail. The case was no longer cold. It was shockingly, blisteringly hot. The rock hammer, now designated as a key piece of evidence, was carefully packaged and driven under escort to the Montana State Crime Lab in Missoula. There, it was delivered into the hands of Dr. Eva Rostova, the lab's chief forensic palynologist. Eva was a woman whose professional life was a study in the microscopic. She inhabited a world of infinitesimal clues, a sterile, climate-controlled laboratory filled with high-powered scanning electron microscopes, gas chromatographs, and mass spectrometers. She was brilliant, meticulous, and possessed a deep, almost reverential respect for the durability of her chosen subject, pollen. To the untrained eye, the hammer was just a rusty tool. To Eva, it was a time capsule, a silent witness that had trapped a record of its journey in microscopic grains. Her process was a model of scientific rigor. Dressed in a sterile clean suit in a positive pressure room to prevent contamination, she began by meticulously scraping and vacuuming the hammer's surface, dividing it into sections. The outer exposed surfaces would tell her where it had been recently. The deeper crevices, the protected space where the steel head met the vinyl grip, might hold an older story. She mounted the initial samples on slides, her movements precise and economical. As she explained to the detectives observing from behind a glass wall, forensic palynology operates on a simple but powerful principle. Every plant produces pollen or spores with a unique identifiable morphology, she said, her voice slightly tinny over the intercom. Think of them as biological fingerprints. They are also incredibly durable. Their outer shell, the exine, can survive for thousands, even millions of years, and they tell you about location and time. A specific pollen assemblage can place an object in a specific ecosystem during a specific season. The first results were expected. The outer layers of sediment on the hammer contained a mix of pollen from pine, fir, and various alpine grasses, all consistent with the high-altitude avalanche site where Chloe and Liam had found it. It was the second sample, however, the one painstakingly extracted from a tiny, protected crevice near the top of the handle, that changed everything. This sample was different. It was cleaner, more concentrated, and dominated by a single type of pollen. The moment of discovery was not a dramatic shout, but a quiet, sharp intake of breath. Eva was at her electron microscope, looking at the images of the grains from the protected crevice magnified 50,000 times. The shape was unmistakable. It was a spheroidal grain with a distinctive, finely reticulate surface. She ran the morphology through the lab's reference database. The match was instantaneous and absolute. Claytonia megarrhiza, the alpine spring beauty. Her mind immediately began cross-referencing the data. Claytonia megarrhiza is a highly specialized plant. It grows only in the loose, gravelly soil of alpine fell fields, typically above 10,000 feet. More importantly, its blooming season is incredibly short and specific. It is one of the first flowers to emerge after the snow melts, blooming for just 2 to 3 weeks in late May or early June, before vanishing for the rest of the year. Eva leaned back in her chair, a thrill of intellectual shock running through her. A paradox was forming in her mind, clear and sharp as a crystal. Eris and Leo Thorne had disappeared in early September. The hammer had been found in late March, exposed by an avalanche. But here, preserved in a protected crevice, was a concentrated dose of pollen that could only have been deposited on the hammer during a late spring blooming season. The conclusion was inescapable, and it was staggering. The hammer had not been lying on that mountainside for 7 years. It had been somewhere else. Specifically, it had been in a high-altitude Claytonia field during the bloom, in a year after Eris Thorne's disappearance. It had been moved, and so had she. The official report, a dry technical document filled with Latin names and statistical analysis, landed on the desk of Detective Miles Corbin of the Park County Sheriff's Office. Corbin was the new lead on the Thorne cold case, having inherited the voluminous files from the now-retired Deputy Henderson. He was a young, sharp investigator, unburdened by the original investigation's failures and frustrations. He read Eva Rostova's report once, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he read it again, the words seeming to rearrange themselves into a new and shocking reality. The entire foundation of the case, the assumption that Eris and Leo had been lost and had perished in the wilderness near where their car was found, crumbled. The hammer wasn't a clue to where they had died. It was proof that Eris, at least, had been alive for months, possibly even years, after she vanished. Corbin leaned back, the squeak of his chair loud in the quiet office. His mind reeled. The case had been turned completely on its head. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was something far more complex and far more sinister. It was a kidnapping, and it was still active. The forensic paradox forced a complete reset. In a small, windowless conference room, Detective Corbin assembled a new, leaner team. On a large monitor, Dr. Ava Rostova's face was clear via video call, and next to Corbin sat a young, prodigiously bright GIS specialist from the county planning department named Kenji. The old maps with their sprawling search grids were gone. In their place was a single, stark question on a whiteboard. Where was the hammer between September year 1 and March year 7? "Eva, talk us through it again," Corbin said. "The location is high, above 10,000 feet, Eva reiterated. "The soil has to be alpine scree or fellfield, and the hammer was there during the bloom, late May or early June. This isn't just a place. It's a place at a specific time of year." Kenji, the GIS specialist, was already working. "Okay," he said, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "I can build a model. I'll layer topographical data for elevation, geological surveys for soil type, and satellite vegetation maps. We can generate a probability map of every location in the Gallatin and Madison ranges that supports a Claytonia megarrhiza habitat." The new investigation methodology was surgical. They weren't throwing bodies at the landscape anymore. They were following a ghost map drawn by microscopic pollen grains. The GIS model produced a map speckled with a few dozen patches of red, indicating high probability zones. Most were in designated wilderness areas, inaccessible and uninhabited. But as Corbin and Kenji began to overlay another data set, county property records, a handful of the red patches lit up with new significance. They corresponded with old, isolated parcels of private land, mostly defunct mining claims from the late 19th century, grandfathered in before the surrounding lands became national forest. These were off-grid properties, accessible only by primitive tracks, places where someone could disappear. The painstaking work of digging through dusty analog property records began. Many of the claims were owned by defunct corporations or families who hadn't set foot on them in 50 years. But one, a 20-acre plot centered on a high, barren ridge, had been purchased 15 years ago by a couple named Silas and Alara Vance. Their paper trail went cold about 10 years ago. No taxes paid, no updated address. They were ghosts. The new search was nothing like the first. It wasn't an army. It was two men in a four-wheel drive county truck, grinding their way up a barely there road that was more of a stream bed than a path. Corbin drove, wrestling with the wheel as the truck lurched over rocks and through deep ruts. The terrain was brutal, a world away from the picturesque tourist loops of Yellowstone. This was a place you came to hide. After an hour of punishing driving, they arrived. The property was a bleak, windswept clearing dominated by a derelict-looking cabin and the skeletal remains of old mining equipment. It felt abandoned, forgotten, but as Corbin got out of the truck, he noticed fresh tire tracks in a muddy patch near the cabin. Someone had been here recently. Behind the cabin, partially concealed by a rotting canvas tarp and a pile of junk, was a dark opening in the mountainside. The entrance to an adit, a horizontal mine shaft. A thick insulated power cable ran from a nearby solar panel array into the darkness. This was it. With weapons drawn, Corbin and his deputy entered the mine. The temperature dropped instantly. The air was cold, damp, and smelled of stone and mildew. 10 yards in, the narrow shaft opened into a larger, hand-dug chamber, and they found the primary crime scene. It was a horrifying tableau. A simple cot sat in one corner. A bucket served as a toilet. But it was the walls that made Corbin's blood run cold. They were covered in carvings, not random scratches, but intricate, precise lines, symbols, and cross-sections. They were geological maps carved directly into the stone, the work of a desperate, brilliant mind. Eris Thorne's work. This was her prison. In a small dark alcove at the back of the chamber, they found the remains. A partial skeleton carefully wrapped in a worn blanket. It was Eris. The search for her was over. But as the forensics team began the grim task of processing the scene, a junior deputy noticed a loose rock in the wall near the remains. He pried it out. Behind it, in a small, hidden cavity, was the nested discovery, the clue that changed everything once again. There was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, the kind of thing a child would whittle, and next to it, a faded, worn copy of a children's reading primer, Fun with Dick and Jane. On the inside cover, in a child's careful printing, was the name Leo, but the name had been furiously scribbled over in thick crayon, and underneath it, in a different, shakier hand, another name was written, Caleb. Leo hadn't died. He had been taken, and he had been renamed. The hunt for the shadow, the person who had scribbled the name Caleb over Leo, began with the primer book. The small, tattered volume became the central artifact of the investigation. The State Crime Lab went over it with microscopic precision. They lifted several sets of fingerprints. One set, faint but clear, belonged to Eris Thorne. Another, smaller set was unidentifiable, likely Leo's. But a third set, found smeared on the cover and several pages, belonged to an unknown adult. The prints were run through the national AFIS database, but there was no match. The person who had held this book had no criminal record. The investigation pivoted back to the owners of the mine, Silas and Elara Vance. They were phantoms. Corbin's team hit one dead end after another. They had purchased the mining claim with cash 15 years prior. They had no credit cards, no bank accounts, no social media presence. They had systematically erased themselves from the modern world. It was a digital and bureaucratic fortress, seemingly impenetrable. Frustration mounted in the incident room. The case had transformed from a wilderness mystery to a homicide and kidnapping, yet the suspects were as spectral as they had been for the past 7 years. Corbin assigned his team to frustrating, granular tasks. They chased down distant relatives of the Vances, most of whom hadn't seen or heard from them in over a decade. They found an old address for Silas's brother in Oregon, only to discover he had passed away from cancer 5 years earlier. Each lead dissolved into nothing. The trail was not just cold, it felt non-existent. They had a crime scene, a victim, and the ghost of a second victim, but they couldn't put a name or a face to the shadow that connected them all. The breakthrough, when it came, was from the most junior member of the team, a young analyst named Diaz, whose specialty was open-source intelligence. While the senior detectives were chasing paper records, Diaz was plumbing the deep, strange corners of the Internet. For days, she searched obscure forums using keywords like off-grid, homeschool, Wyoming, and geology. Finally, she found it. A single post from 6 years ago on a forgotten forum for off-grid homesteaders. A user with the handle Mountain Mama had asked a question. "We have a wonderful boy, a surprise late-in-life gift. He's 8 now. Does anyone have recommendations for a non-religious homeschooling curriculum for this age? He's bright but has trouble with reading." The post itself was innocuous, but Diaz's instincts told her this was something. An 8-year-old boy, 6 years ago. That would make him 14 now, the same age as Leo Thorne. The forum was so old that the administrators had long since abandoned it, but the server logs were still accessible. TSS submitted a subpoena. A day later, the answer came back. The IP address from that single post was registered to a satellite internet provider. The service contract, paid for with cash orders sent to a P.O. box, was under the name Elara Croft. Croft, a new name, a new thread to pull. Corbin ran Elara Croft through the DMV databases of surrounding states. He got a hit. A driver's license, issued 2 years ago in the state of Idaho. The photo showed a woman in her late 50s, her face worn and tired, her eyes holding a haunted, defensive look. The address was for a small, single-family home in the struggling timber town of Pierce, Idaho, 200 miles from the mine. With a name and a location, the Vances, now the Crofts, materialized from the shadows. Corbin quickly pulled their deeper history. The bankruptcy records from 16 years ago painted a picture of financial ruin. A search of sealed medical records obtained with a warrant revealed the humanizing context, the core of their desperate opportunism. Elara had suffered multiple miscarriages, followed by a diagnosis of irreversible infertility. They were a couple who had lost everything society valued: money, status, the promise of a family. They had retreated from that society, nursing a profound and painful wound, a desperate, aching desire for a child they could never have. The profile was complete. They weren't monsters. They were broken people who had done a monstrous thing. The quiet residential street in Pierce, Idaho, felt a world away from the rugged peaks of the Gallatin Range. The houses were small, clad in faded siding, the lawns a patchwork of green and brown. It was a town that had seen better days, a place where people kept to themselves. Detective Corbin and his team approached the house at 412 Maple Street with a quiet, deliberate tension. There were no sirens, no flashing lights. A weathered man with stooped shoulders and a face like cracked leather was in the front yard, attempting to pull a stubborn weed from a neglected flower bed. This was Silas Vance. As they approached, a woman's face, framed by graying hair, appeared in the front window, watching them. Elara. Through the window behind her, Corbin could see the flicker of a television and the silhouette of a teenage boy slouched on a sofa. The approach was over. The confrontation had begun. They sat in a cramped, stuffy living room that smelled of dust and stale coffee. Corbin didn't bluster or threaten. He simply laid out the truth on the scratched coffee table between them, piece by agonizing piece. He spoke of a rock hammer, of a specific type of pollen, of an old mine shaft. He described the geological maps carved into the stone walls. Silas Vance didn't even try to lie. The fight had gone out of him years ago. He sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking, and began to talk. The first barrel of the revelation was fired. His confession was a torrent of grim, pathetic detail. They had been out foraging near their claim when they heard a cry for help. They found Aris at the bottom of a shallow, wooded ravine. She had slipped and fallen, suffering a compound fracture in her leg. Her son Leo was with her, terrified but physically unharmed. Their first instinct, Silas insisted, was to help. They brought them back to their cabin, but then they saw the news reports on their small, battery-powered TV. They saw the scale of the search. They knew who they had, and their desperation, their poverty, their isolation, twisted their thinking. An opportunity. Aris was a geologist. Their land was worthless. But what if it wasn't? They kept her. They moved her to the mine when she tried to escape. They forced her to use her brilliant mind, her deep knowledge of the earth, to map the geothermal potential of their land, to identify mineral veins, anything they could sell or lease. For 5 years she was their prisoner, a slave to their pathetic ambition. She fought them, she resisted, but she was trapped, injured, and her spirit slowly eroded. She grew weaker, malnourished. 2 years ago, she contracted pneumonia in the damp cold of the mine, and she died. Silas admitted that he had buried her there in the back of her prison. And in a final desperate attempt to control the narrative, he had taken her hammer and planted it on the avalanche-prone slope miles away, hoping that if it were ever found, it would reinforce the old story of a hiker lost to the elements. He finished speaking, and a heavy silence filled the room. It was done. The primary mystery was solved. Corbin felt a grim sense of resolution. It was a horrific, tragic end, but it was an end. Corbin let the silence hang for a moment. He looked at the broken man in front of him, then at the silent woman by his side. His gaze shifted toward the doorway to the other room, where the sound of the television still droned on. He asked the pivotal question, the one that would unlock the second more terrible truth. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "And the boy? What about Leo?" It was Alara who answered. She hadn't spoken a word until now. Her voice was brittle, thin as ice, but laced with a fierce, defiant ownership. "His name is Caleb," she said, her eyes locking onto Corbin's. The statement was a correction, a demand. "He doesn't remember anything else. He was only 7. We told him his mother died giving birth to him on the mountain. We told him we were all he had." She took a ragged breath, a lifetime of thwarted maternal hunger pouring into her next words. "He's our son. He is all we have." The final shocking twist landed with the force of a physical blow. The investigators in the room sat in stunned, horrified silence. The air seemed to crystallize. This was a crime beyond kidnapping, beyond murder. They hadn't just stolen a child. They had stolen his entire history, his memory, his very identity. They had erased Leo Thorne and created Caleb Vance in his place, building a life for themselves on the foundations of a stolen soul. The full, monstrous scope of their desperation was finally, hideously clear. The recovery of the boy who was once Leo Thorne was not a rescue. It was a delicate, heartbreaking extraction. Child Protective Services, working with a child psychologist, handled the interaction with a gentle professionalism that felt utterly inadequate for the task. The boy they called Caleb was now 14, a teenager with his father's eyes and a stranger's history. When he was separated from Silas and Alara, he didn't understand. He was terrified, confused, crying for the only parents he had ever known, the people who were now being led away in handcuffs. The reunion with Ben was not the cathartic, tearful embrace of a Hollywood film. It was held in a sterile, quiet room at a social services building. It was profoundly, painfully awkward. Ben saw his son's face, but the eyes that looked back at him were filled with the fear and suspicion of a cornered animal looking at a stranger. Leo, or Caleb, saw a man whose face was a ghostly echo of his own, a man who claimed to be his father, but who felt like an intruder from a world he couldn't remember. It was the beginning of a long, treacherous walk home, a journey across a chasm of 7 stolen years. The legal fate of Silas and Alara Vance was swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the forensic link from the hammer, the crime scene in the mine, the living proof of the kidnapping, their defense was non-existent. They were charged with felony murder for Eris's death occurring during the commission of a kidnapping, as well as kidnapping, child abuse, and a litany of other crimes. They pled guilty, avoiding a trial that would have forced the boy to testify. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, disappearing into the correctional system as completely as they had once disappeared from the world. The legal process was a series of clean, logical steps, a stark and brutal contrast to the tangled, emotional chaos it left in its wake. Justice was served, but it did nothing to heal the wounds. The aftermath for Ben was a new kind of prison. The single-minded purpose that had sustained him for 7 years, the fight to find the truth, was gone. He had won his war only to find himself faced with an impossible peace. He was no longer just the grieving widower, the keeper of a cold case. He was the father of a deeply traumatized teenager who shared his DNA, but not his life. The house that had been a shrine to memory now had to become a home for a living, breathing stranger. The first few months were a landscape of silent meals and closed doors. Ben insisted on calling him Leo, a gentle but firm reclaiming of his identity, spent most of his time in his room, the room that had been kept exactly as he'd left it, now alien to him. Ben struggled. He tried to connect, to talk about Eris, to share stories of a life Leo couldn't remember. The boy's responses were monosyllabic, his posture defensive. There were moments of profound despair, nights when Ben would sit in his study, the map still on the wall, and feel an overwhelming sense of failure. He had brought his son home, but he felt more distant from him than ever. But there were also small victories, tiny glimmers of light, a shared glance over a documentary about volcanoes, a hesitant question from Leo about a rock specimen on Eris's desk. Each one was a fragile step on a long road. Months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, Ben took Leo to the cemetery. Eris's grave was marked by a simple, elegant headstone of polished granite. For a long time, they just stood there in silence. Then Ben began to talk. He didn't talk about the mine or the Vances. He talked about Eris. He told Leo about the day she found her first fossil, about her infectious laugh, about her boundless love for rocks and for him. He spoke of her as a living, vibrant person, not a tragic victim. When he finished, the silence returned, but it felt different, less heavy. Leo, who had been clenching and unclenching his fists, reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, perfectly smooth, gray stone, a river rock he must have picked up somewhere. Without a word, he bent down and carefully placed the stone on top of the headstone. It was a geologist's gesture of remembrance, a tribute Eris would have understood. It was the first time Leo had willingly participated in a memory of her. They stood there for a long time as the sun began to set, two strangers bound by an immeasurable loss, a shared name, and the faintest glimmer of a future. It was not a happy ending. It was not an ending at all. It was the complicated, painful, and hopeful beginning of a lifetime of healing.